What we want to talk about today is looking at some principles then of how we respond, given that we are really starting from two very different worldviews as Christians in our culture today. There's so very little that we share with our culture in terms of ultimate beliefs and assumptions about the world.
Welcome to another Prepared to Answer podcast. My name is Shawn Walker, and I'm joined by Scott Steen for the last in our series on the Canadian Bill C6. How are you, Scott?
Good, Shawn. Good to be back.
Good. So I thought we could start, Scott, with maybe recapping our first two episodes from the series. And I want to remind our listeners, if you haven't had a chance to listen, we'd encourage you to go to preparedtoanswer.org and listen to those podcasts. But we thought maybe we could start with a quick recap. So our first episode was on the bill itself. So what we really wanted to do is lay a foundation for what the bill is and why we should be concerned as Christians as to what this bill is. What I like, Scott, in our second episode is we then moved to how we could see Bill C6 as an opportunity for Christians. And I thought maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, and that formed the content of our last discussion, which was really just seeing it as an opportunity to get a window into the worldview of our culture a little more clearly. Because I think in particular the bill, and we looked specifically at the language of the preamble to the bill last week, which I think really gives us some insights into the beliefs that our culture really espouses and holds now. And we talked in particular about the two underlying assumptions behind the bill, which were the assumptions of authenticity and the assumptions of self-creation, and really the worldview that supports those set of assumptions. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of formed the discussion and the benefit of the bill. It just gives us some insights into the way our world thinks, right, which I think will help us in our witness, as Paul said, to demolish the arguments and pretensions that set themselves up against the knowledge of God.
Right, yeah. Right. These hollow philosophies.
Yes.
So where we ended that episode then was really the question is, how do we respond to these hollow philosophies?
Yeah, and so that's what I want to talk about in this episode is really some practical principles, and that's what I want to look at. It's difficult to say, well, here's a script of what you should say.
Right.
And it's not as though people just speak and say, you know what, based on the assumption of authenticity and self-creation, that's not how people talk. But those ideas are hidden and packaged in the thoughts and the values that people espouse.
Right. So
what we want to talk about today is looking at some principles then of how we respond, given that we are really starting from two very different worldviews as Christians in our culture today. There's so very little that we share with our culture in terms of ultimate beliefs and assumptions about the world. So how do we respond? In the article we posted a couple of weeks ago on what Christians can learn from anti-conversion therapy laws, I listed three principles for, answering this question, how do we respond? And I'll just briefly touch on those, and then I have a few other things to say, looking at some of the guidance from the Apostle Paul in terms of how to carry on in our witness in such a different world that we find ourselves in. The first thing I think we need to remember is that we don't use worldly tactics in the way that we react and respond to the world. There's so much in the public dialogue, in the public square, there's so much heat being generated, controversy and opposition. And it's often very heated. Often it's very condescending, the way people respond and react. And I think we need to remember as believers that we can't resent unbelievers for the way that they think. No. Resentment ought not be reflected in the tone that we use, even when referring to arguments and positions that we disagree with. Rather, here's what Paul says in 2 Timothy 2:24. I think this gives us good guidance about our posture. Paul says that the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but must be kind to everyone. Let that sink in for a minute, Shawn. Being kind to everyone.
Right.
Regardless of political ideology or political affiliation, right? Kind to everyone. That is the calling we're given.
And I would argue that we're not seeing a lot of kindness on social media, at least, when it relates to some of these issues.
I'll be honest with you. There have been a lot of things on social media that I have seen come from Christians that are downright unkind. And I find it disheartening. And I think maybe we get permission from the fact that that's how everybody else engages on social media. And, and of course, controversy gets attention on social media, so the more controversial you can be, the more attention you can get. But I don't think we can use that as justification. No. I think we can afford to be kind toward everyone because truth doesn't require belligerence or coercion for its defense. We don't need to be mean, right, in order to make a point.
In fact, this last week was a great example. We had some comments on social media on our Facebook site that could have started off in a mean way, and I think you did an excellent job to show kindness, and it was amazing how it disarmed the conversation.
Well, it's very kind for you to say, but you're right. Yeah, we often get comments on social media posts, and if they're from opposing viewpoints, a lot of times the tone is very combative. Right. It's almost like they're baiting us into an argument. Sure. And maybe there's a place for that, for those kinds of heated discussions. I don't like to talk that way. Right. I don't like to engage that way. And so I went out of my way to be kind in response, and not surprisingly, it changed the tone.
It did. In
not being belligerent or hostile, this person's tone quickly changed, and actually it ended up being an amicable discussion.
Exactly.
So I think that's a great illustration of the principle, I think, that we need to remember. Yeah. For sure. So we don't use worldly tactics first. The second is to remember that, Shawn, we demolish ideas. This is coming from the words of the Apostle Paul. We demolish ideas. We don't demolish people, right? Even people we disagree with strongly. Mm-hmm. I think it's worthwhile remembering, again, what Paul tells us, going back to 2 Timothy 2, that all of us apart from Christ are willfully rebellious against God. Our sin is a willful sin, right? But at the same time, Paul describes the unbeliever as caught in the trap of the devil, he says, and captive to do his will. Because of sin, Paul said in Romans chapter 1, we're darkened in our understanding, and our thinking has become futile. As a consequence, we're in bondage to Satan because Satan is the master of deception, right? Yeah. And so we cannot see the darkness of his deception because our eyes are blinded. So I think realizing that, I think, should always maintain for us a sense of solidarity with and compassion for anyone, regardless of their ideological pre-commitments. We as Christians, we need to lose the mentality of us versus them.
Yes.
I don't think that reflects the gospel, and I certainly don't think it communicates the love of Christ. And also, I think in resisting that, I think that will set us apart in our culture, which, with issues around intersectionality and group identity and group politics, I think that would really set us apart.
Yeah, it would.
Right. We need to remember that those who oppose us are not our enemies. They're captives of our enemy. So that's the second principle. The third one, I think, is to realize that we are living witnesses of the truth. We need to remember, Shawn, that the cultural beliefs or the worldview that undergirds authenticity and self-creation, it doesn't line up with reality. Right? It's a false worldview, and which means that authenticity and self-creation are counterfeits in terms of supplying true meaning. That's just the reality. That's not an argument. It's just a statement of reality. In light of that, I think we need to remember again something that Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3. He was speaking to the church, and he was referring to them and their lives. He called them living letters, that their own lives gave living testament to the ministry of the gospel that he had among them. Right? Our lives are what reflect gospel reality. Now, that doesn't mean we don't proclaim the truth of the gospel, but it means that our lives also reflect that truth. And I think we need to remember that in taking seriously the call that God has on our lives to walk faithfully in discipleship. And I think it's just worth being reminded of, especially right now, where during COVID and so much shutdown and everything else, even before COVID, Shawn, I think there was a tendency among believers in the West to undervalue the community of the church, that our faith very much becomes an individual exercise, which I think is a spillover from our Western individualism. Sure. But the church is a community, And I think for us to really bear witness to the gospel realities that are true of our lives, that our lives are meant to reflect, we need to take seriously God's call on us to belong to the church. By this will all men know that you are my disciples, right? Jesus said, by your love for one another. So living in community, I think living out those gospel realities, that has to be a part of our response to a world that has gone so far away from, the worldview of the Bible.
So those are three great principles, Scott. But I'm thinking maybe our listeners might be thinking, if I'm in a conversation, this is a bill that is discussed and talked about in society right now. What kind of things can I say? Are there questions? Are there some principles for now that we can put into place?
Yeah, I was giving some thought to that. And again, I lean a lot on the Apostle Paul, who was, the greatest Christian missionary that ever lived, the great apostle to the Gentiles. And I just find so much in his writing that instructs and equips us that's so relevant to our culture today. In Acts 17, Paul went into Athens, and I think that that account of his engagement with the Athenians, I think gives us some great instruction on how to actually talk to people. What kinds of things can we actually say? Now, I can't give you a script because there's no way we can script every conversation that you'll ever enter into. But I think we can get some guidance from Paul on how we talk and what kind of things we say to people. What seems to me to be one of the best ways to respond is by simply raising really good questions. Questions have a way of disarming people because it's not a direct affront on here's my idea against your idea. As soon as that happens, right, the walls go up. Questions are disarming though because it's as if we're asking a question together and no one's explicitly presenting an answer.
No,
right?
And it is making the person think about what they actually truly believe.
Yeah, and I think God can use that. Just raising good questions. Greg Koukl, who's one of my favorite apologists, he refers to this as putting a pebble in their shoe, right? You know what it's like to walk with a pebble in your shoe over time. It's always there. It's always nagging you. And I think really well-placed questions can act that way. When I look at Paul in Acts 17, I see his engagement with the Athenians. He's gone around, he's looked at their idols, he's observed their religious activities and environment, and now he's speaking to them and he's appealing to them. And I see that he really does three things, and I think that are so brilliant in terms of opening the door to presenting the truth of the gospel in a context that's completely antithetical to the Bible. Like the Greco-Roman worldview was completely opposite to the biblical worldview, much like our cultural worldview is opposite to the biblical worldview. Three things I see Paul doing is this. The first thing I see him doing is that he affirms what he can affirm. Right. He's talking to people and he draws them in, if you will, or opens up the dialogue by affirming, what he can affirm with them. He says, your idols reveal, at least that you're deeply religious, right? You even have an idol to an unknown God, which means you're acknowledging the limitations you have in recognizing or fully grasping the realm of the divine, right? And then he says, even your poets admit of this ultimate divinity as being the cause of our existence. He quotes two of their poets, first saying, for in him we live and move and have our being. That was one of their Cretan poets from 600 BC. And the other one said, we are his offspring. Right? This is a Sicilian poet who had written about, he was ultimately writing about Zeus. But Paul's using these cultural contact points to say, look at your big ideas. Some of your big ideas have merit. So first affirming what you can affirm, but then helping them to question themselves. And this is what Paul then moves into. He affirms their religious belief. Some of their religious assumptions are right. He said, but then he uses that to point out that the outworking seems to be inconsistent. If you believe in that there's a divine or a God in whom everything finds its existence, then why do you behave as if he can be housed in a little stone temple or represented by a golden idol, right? Or somehow needs your religious services? Right. Those two things don't seem to jive, right? So he then helps them to question their own religious assumptions or religious beliefs. And then the last thing I see him do then is in addressing the need of the heart that only the gospel can meet. And this is down in verse 26, where he affirms their understanding of the divine, and then he starts pointing them towards the fact that, in fact, what they see as unknown, the Jews worship as known. And he's speaking about now the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Bible. He says, "For from one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands." Again, he's agreeing with them on the universal scope of this divine, ruling, causing power, which is the God of the Bible. He said God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him. And here I think is the hard issue that the gospel meets. Reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us. What he's punctuating is that God wants you to find him. He wants you to know him. Okay, that is the heart need that the gospel meets. Whether people agree with it or not, that is the need that the gospel meets. This is eternal life, Jesus said, that they know you, the one true God. That is what we need. Okay, so Paul addresses it.
Those are great principles from Paul, a timeless example of how to interact with our culture. So then, how do we take that and move it now to today?
I'm going to use an example of moving now to understand our Athens.
Yes.
And I don't think this is something you can learn from one podcast, but this is, I'm going to present some things that I hope you'll find helpful. We will pray that God could use some of this to inform a conversation at some point. Yes. It's not a cookie-cutter approach. I think we simply need to become students of learning how to do these kinds of things and learning how to have these kinds of conversations. Like Paul, we want to understand our Athens, and I think we can use his principles to do that. And so let me use this as an illustration. Let me use this as an example or a model. And it's something that we mentioned last week, and I quoted in my article. It's a quote by Demi Lovato, who's an actress and singer, who was on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. Oh, this is now back in February sometime. But she was in that, among other things she spoke about in that episode, was her own sexuality, her own self-understanding of herself sexually. And of course, like so many other discussions, she got into that. One of the things she said, though, in the course of that discussion was, and she was referring really to her upbringing, and I think she had a fairly traditional upbringing, and reacting to that, she said, "I'm done living other people's truths." Right? Yeah. I'm here to tell you that I'm going to live my truth no matter what you think, because it feels right to me. I kind of thought of that, and I thought, okay, what if I was sitting across the table in that conversation and this statement is made? How then can I respond in a way that moves toward Christian witness without shutting the conversation down? And I think that's key. When we take sound bites like that in isolation, we simply want to see how to defeat them when we remember we don't demolish people, we demolish ideas. So that means we need to preserve the person, and this is we want to continue a relationship, or foster a relationship, and not shut it down. And I think Paul can help us do that. So if I were sitting across the table, how could I, using Paul's, example here, how could I redemptively guide this conversation?
So how would you start? By affirming that statement. How would you start with agreeing with that statement?
Okay, and that can be tricky, but I think, if we're thoughtful, I think we can find things to affirm so that the person is affirmed.
Sure.
Right? Not so they walk away thinking we agree with everything, but so that there's an openness. And I think, like Paul, we can affirm what they affirm. What could I affirm in anything she said there? I think one thing I could affirm is her statement, "I'm done living other people's truths." I think I could say, you know what, you're right. We really shouldn't let other people's beliefs control our lives, should we? No. I think that's something we can agree on. Right. Sure, why not? So affirm what we can affirm, but then help them question their own beliefs. And I think this is again the power of a question. Right. If I just come straight on and try and defeat the statement, right, the wall will go up and the conversation will end. Maybe I will, on rationalistic grounds, win the argument, but then I've lost the person.
Exactly.
And so what have I won, really?
Nothing.
Maybe it's a little different if this is an online debate or something, a debate in a university and ideas are being debated. But that's different. That's not where most of us live.
Right.
Most of us live in coffee shops having conversations.
Right.
I affirm what I can affirm, then help them question themselves. And as I think about Demi's statements, she says, first of all, I'm going to live my truth.
Right.
Which, I mean, that's almost uncontestable in our culture. Of course, we all live our own truths, right? I would want to ask this question. Can we really live in a world where everyone makes their own truth? Think about that. Really, could we really have a world where that were the case? And you could maybe try and apply that, to its ultimate end and see how ridiculous it might make the world look. And I think a more realistic question, what happens when in order to live your truth, you have to invalidate or require me to change my truth? And I think that's a very legitimate question. And actually, there's an illustration. I want to share this because I think it's absolutely pertinent to this. It illustrates the reality of that objection. A great book by Carl Trueman, which I would recommend people read, called The Triumph of the Modern Self. It's a great window into understanding the history of thought and how we've arrived at where we have arrived in terms of sense of self, understanding, how our culture has arrived this way. But in his book, he gives this example in talking about this very thing, the conflict between in terms of making our own truths. And the conflict he illustrates is in the conflict between the ideologies of sexual orientation and transgenderism. And we often see these things, LGBT as a unified movement. It's unified as a social movement.
Right.
But in terms of ideology, there's some real conflict. For instance, in the case of sexual orientation, for the most part, if you're a homosexual or a lesbian, your identity is grounded in your sexual orientation, the idea that you, whether you're a man or a woman, you're attracted to a member of the same sex, a man to a man or a woman to a woman. Well, in order for that to be a concrete identity, it does rely upon the gender binary. Whereas transgenderism is really the move to dissolve the gender binary for the most part. Now, even within transgender ideology, there's some discussion about that, which is interesting. But for the most part, it's the idea that gender is a social construct. So it's not real. Here's an illustration that Trueman shares, which I think is really interesting. He says, take, for example, the following personal testimony of a lesbian living with a partner who transitioned from female to male. And here's the testimony. When my partner began his gender transition, my lesbian identity had been central to my life and my sense of self for well over a decade. And I didn't know what of course, in saying his, he's referring to his female, now transitioned to male partner, what his transition made me. Some people told me I was obviously still a lesbian, but it was just as obvious to others that I was now straight or bisexual. It wasn't obvious to me at all, and I struggled with it for a long time. Now I've been a partner with a trans man for as long as I was a lesbian, and I've gotten comfortable with just not having a name for what I think I am. I think without, I don't bring that up to disparage that person's story at all. I think what it does is powerfully illustrates the real conflict of trying to live out this idea that we can create our own truth or our own identity. It just doesn't seem supportable or sustainable. So to ask that question about this statement, I'm going to live my own truth, Demi also says something else. She says, because it feels right to me, which I think betrays or reveals the knowledge principle for this generation. How do we know things are true? Well, because it feels right. I guess I could ask the question, do you think relying on our feelings as a guide to knowledge is really a wise course to take? And they might just say yes. But have you ever been deceived by your feelings? Have they ever led you astray? Right? Have you ever regretted feelings that you had and consequent actions that they've led you to take? I know I have. I've had things that in the spur of the moment, they felt this is what I have to do. This is absolutely right. And I did it. And then afterwards, the regret.
Yeah.
I wish I had not done that. What happens if your feelings change? And if they change, what does that say about your truth? Right? If they do. It almost seems as if our feelings determine what's true and our feelings can change, then I don't think truth is a good word to use.
No.
Right? Because suddenly what we're calling true is something that is unstable and changing,
Right.
which is
Which is
opposite.
not truth.
That's the opposite of truth.
Right. Exactly.
Notice, though, Shawn, that I'm not supplying any answers.
No. You're making the person think about what they believe.
Yeah, and you know what? And I don't think you can be manipulative in asking these kinds of questions like they're loaded questions. Sometimes people can ask you a question and it's like the
Right.
answer is implicit.
Right.
I think to be genuine, to say, you know what, I think about that, but here's a question I really struggle with, if this is the case.
Yeah. Because in some cases, they may never have asked themselves that question.
That's possible. Sure.
Right. And even if there is no response to the answer from yourself, it may cause them to think down the road
Yep.
about what they've said because they've never maybe been asked that.
Yeah. And I think this is where then we do our best to raise questions and then we let God by his Holy Spirit go to work. We have no idea what kinds of inner doubts or struggles a person is experiencing as they're trying to live out their own truth. And the feelings of, uncertainty and doubt, God may well be using those things. Mm-hmm. And a well-placed question can just be a tool that God can continue to use to move them in a direction that only he can do.
So it also takes the pressure off of us to have all the answers.
Yeah,
as well.
Sure, it does.
Right? We can even just be left with asking the question.
Yeah.
And not responding to whatever their answer is. And just say, that's interesting. And then let the Spirit work on them.
Maybe we should change the name of our ministry to Prepared to Question.
That's right.
Might be more appropriate.
Yes.
Sure. So in that, we're simply helping people to ask good questions of the beliefs that they are putting forward, that they're holding. Yeah. The last thing then, and I think that's something that we want to try to always move towards, as Paul did, is then addressing the need of the heart that only the gospel can meet. Mm. And I think in this statement that Demi Lovato makes, I think there is a heart need being expressed that only the gospel can meet. And so what I would want to say to her is this, is that it seems in that statement, correct me if I'm wrong, that the real issue that you're stating here, the real issue you're highlighting, is our need to truly know who we are and to be at peace with that. That's what it seems that she's getting at. Right. And not to allow someone else to dictate that to us. And as a sentiment, I can get on board with that. Right. That's an absolutely essential human need. Now,
so through that, you're affirming them. We're going back to the first principle.
Yeah, I think that's another way of affirming.
Yeah.
It's not the need that we're disagreeing with.
No.
It's the assumption about the answer to that need.
Right.
And of course, we understand that only through Christ Jesus, those needs can be met.
Right.
So how do we open a door then? We're agreeing on the principle, we're agreeing on the heart need. Right. How can I open a door to the gospel? Here are just some suggestions, Shawn. These are not answers. I did not have this conversation with Demi Lovato, but here is how I would, and again, these are things I've thought of in the moment in the hot seat. I'm not sure I would have thought of these things, but these are things, if we think about them beforehand, God might be able to use. I could say, I've struggled with the same thing. And I also have not found any answers in religion. I think we confirm that. Religion's not the answer.
No.
Right. But I can at least then testify, but you know what? I have discovered my true identity. I've found it, and I'm at complete peace with it, but it's in my relationship with Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. It's in him securing my identity, and my identity being secured in my relationship with him. Okay. Would you mind if I shared more about that with you? Could I tell you my own story? If they say yes, you've got an open door. If they say no, well, at least you've borne witness. Yeah. Or you could say something like, have you ever wondered? The question of have you ever wondered is a great open-ended question. Yeah. Have you ever wondered if our deep need to truly know who we are points to the possibility that we were made for a purpose.
Yeah.
Right? The fact that we need meaning, and we're affirming what our world is saying is that we can create our own. But at least what we're agreeing on is the need for it. We absolutely need meaning. I'm not sure we can create our own. I think the deep need that we all know we have for it, I think points to something else. I think it points to the fact that we were made for something and that we need to live for whatever that something is to feel fulfilled.
Yeah.
Could it be that the key to discovering who we are then is to discover who God is? Again, an open-ended question. Or have you ever wondered if that restlessness we feel about truly finding ourselves, have you ever wondered if maybe that's like a homing beacon that God has built into us so that we would actually look for him? And you know what the Bible actually says? For those who seek him will find him. And that's basically what Paul said to the Athenians. And that may be a thought that the person has never had.
What I love about this approach, there's a number of things, Scott. First of all, we're envisioning this in conversation with someone that you may have a relationship with. So this may be family, this may be a friend, this may be someone you see on a regular basis.
Yeah.
So what I've loved that you've said before in talks is that you can ask these questions. You don't have to have all the answers for them in that conversation.
No.
Right? So these questions can get them thinking and get you thinking to their responses so that you may go back and pray and think about their response so that the next time you maybe talk with them and a topic like this kind of comes up, you can say, you know, that conversation that we had there.
Right.
Have you thought
Right.
of this?
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how to use. You know, sometimes people ask and say, "Well, what if I don't have the answer?"
Right.
And you've hit on it right there, Shawn. Oh, that's an opportunity.
Right.
That's an opportunity to pause the conversation and start it up another time.
Right.
That's I don't know. I've never thought of that. Let me think about that, and I'll get back to you, and then carry it on right the next time.
Right. And then the last part, when we were talking about the heart needs of the person that you're talking to, is an opportunity for witness, right? For your own story. And that's what we're called to do as Christians, is to witness to our own story, not to have the academic answers all the time, right? The proofs or the reasons, but to give a testimony to our hope and our knowledge of Christ. And so this asking of questions, being relational, gives us that opportunity to give that witness.
Yep. To tell them how Jesus has transformed your life.
Right.
And of course, that goes back then to what we said at the beginning, is that our lives then need to reflect that.
Right.
And that's a sobering call to faithfulness and why we need the church, why we need one another to live out real transformed Christian living. Because our world needs to see it. Needs to see the church who is enamored by and delighted in Jesus Christ, and that it shows.
Okay, I think that's a great place to finish. What a great example of Bill C6 being an opportunity for us as Christians to possibly open up discussions that could lead to witness for Christ.
Yeah, it just forces us to think through these things, doesn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And help those that we live with and interact on a daily basis to think through that for themselves as well. And hopefully to a discussion about Christ and our need for him. Great. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, Shawn. Enjoyed it. This podcast has been a ministry of Prepared to Answer. Our mission at Prepared to Answer is to help prepare, equip, and encourage the Church of Jesus Christ to grow in confidence of faith by teaching Christians to think like Jesus. To access more resources to help you begin understanding life and the world around you with the mind of Jesus, visit our website at www.preparedtoanswer.org. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Prepared to Answer. Or contact us directly by email at info@preparedtoanswer.org. May the Lord bless and keep you.